Hello everyone, welcome back. I recommend you find a comfortable spot, dim the lights, and just let my voice carry you away for a while. Tonight, I have a story that is incredibly close to my heart. It's about the quiet, heavy tension of an enclosed space, the things we hide behind a uniform, and what happens when the absolute isolation of a massive airplane finally forces two people to face the electricity between them. But before we dive into tonight's story, if you enjoy these BL storytelling videos and want to support the continuation of this channel, you can join my Patreon, SpicyTimeBL. As you probably know, YouTube does not always make it easy to monetize this kind of storytelling content, so Patreon really helps me keep creating these stories for you. You can find the link in the description and in the pinned comment. And for those who want the continuation of these videos, bonus scenes, early access, and more uncensored 18+ BL content, SpicyTimeBL is exactly where you can find it. Your support means the world to me. Alright, let's begin. Imagine the atmosphere of a bustling international airport at 4 in the morning. The fluorescent lights are harsh, the terminal is dead quiet, and the only people moving with any real purpose are the flight crews. Elias Thorne loved this time of day. He was 26 years old, a senior flight attendant who had worked for a major international airline for 4 years. Elias was exactly what you would want in a flight attendant. He was empathetic, incredibly sharp, with warm brown eyes and a smile that could easily diffuse a tense situation with an angry passenger. But this morning, standing in the crew briefing room at JFK, Elias's hands were actually trembling a little as he held his cup of cheap airport coffee. He wasn't nervous about the 14-hour flight to Tokyo. He had done that route a dozen times. He was nervous because of the man standing at the front of the room. Captain Julian Vance. Julian was 36, a former Air Force pilot, and widely known among the cabin crew as the strictest, most unapproachable, and undeniably most gorgeous captain in the entire fleet. He had this sharp, classic, commanding presence. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that had just the faintest dusting of silver at the temples, and piercing steel-gray eyes that always seemed to see right through you. When Julian wore that crisp white shirt with the 4 gold stripes on the shoulders, the entire crew naturally stood a little straighter. Elias had been secretly harboring a massive, hopeless crush on Julian for over a year. They had flown together exactly 3 times before today, and every single time, Elias had felt this heavy, invisible pull toward the man. But Julian was always so professional, so perfectly guarded. He rarely engaged in the usual crew banter. He spoke in a deep, calm, gravelly voice that sent shivers straight down Elias's spine. But his words were always strictly about the flight plan, the weather, or safety protocols. Today, Elias was the purser, the chief flight attendant, which meant he had to work directly with Julian. Julian stood at the front of the briefing table, going over the weather charts with the first officer. As Elias walked into the room and took his seat, Julian paused. He looked up. I want you to picture that moment. The room is full of chatting crew members, but for a second, Julian's eyes locked entirely onto Elias. The bustling sound of the room seemed to fade into a hum. Julian didn't smile, he just stared for a long, heavy second, his gaze trailing from Elias's eyes down to the perfectly knotted tie of his uniform, and then back up. Morning, Elias, Julian said, his voice a low rumble that cut through the noise. Elias's heart did a sudden, violent flip. Good morning, Captain Vance. Just Julian, Elias. We're going to be in a metal tube together for 14 hours. No need for the formalities when it's just the crew. Elias swallowed hard, giving a polite nod. Had Julian just looked at him differently? Or was Elias just projecting his own desperate hopes onto the man? The briefing proceeded. Julian explained that there was a massive winter storm system developing over the northern Pacific and Alaska, but they were cleared to fly above it. 2 hours later, they were in the air. There is a unique kind of isolation when you are cruising at 40,000 feet. The world below you is gone. It's just a vast, endless ocean of blue sky, and inside the cabin, the dull, continuous roar of the jet engines becomes a blanket that wraps around everything. About 5 hours into the flight, the cabin was dark. Most of the passengers in the massive Boeing 777 were asleep. The lights were dimmed to a soft, moody purple. Elias was in the forward galley, quietly organizing the carts, when the interphone chimed. It was the secure line from the flight deck. Elias picked it up. Forward galley, Elias speaking. Elias, came Julian's voice, low and slightly static over the line. Just hearing his name spoken in that deep timbre made Elias grip the plastic phone tighter. Could I get a black coffee up here, please? First officer is on his rest break. It's just me for a bit. Right away, Captain. Elias prepared the coffee. He checked his reflection in the small metal mirror of the galley, smoothing down his hair, feeling incredibly foolish for caring so much. He walked to the secure cockpit door, entered the passcode, and waited for Julian to grant access. The heavy reinforced door clicked open. Stepping into the flight deck at night is like stepping into a spaceship. It was pitch black, illuminated only by the glowing green and amber lights of hundreds of switches, dials, and massive glass displays. Beyond the wide windshield, the sky was a breathtaking canvas of endless, blindingly bright stars. Julian was sitting in the left seat, his headset resting around his neck. He turned as the door locked securely behind Elias. In the dim glow of the instrument panels, Julian looked dangerously handsome. The sharp angles of his jaw were shadowed, and he looked incredibly tired, but undeniably commanding. "Your coffee, Captain," Elias said softly, stepping into the cramped space. "Thank you," Julian murmured. As Julian reached out to take the cup, the airplane hit a tiny pocket of turbulence. It wasn't much, just a slight jolt, but it caused Elias to stumble forward slightly. He braced his hand against the back of Julian's seat to steady himself. At the exact same moment, Julian's hand shot out and caught Elias's wrist. The air in the cockpit instantly stopped moving. Elias froze. Julian's grip on his wrist was firm, warm, and highly protective. His thumb rested right against Elias's pulse point, and Elias knew, with absolute certainty, that Julian could feel his heart hammering like a trapped bird. They stayed like that for a few seconds. Julian didn't let go. He looked up at Elias, his gray eyes catching the soft light of the radar screen. The silence between them was so thick it was almost suffocating. "Careful," Julian said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I'm fine," Elias breathed out, entirely unable to look away from Julian's lips. "Just lost my balance." Julian's thumb slowly, almost imperceptibly, stroked the inside of Elias's wrist before he finally, reluctantly let go. He took the coffee. "Thanks, Elias, for the coffee, and for keeping everything running smoothly back there. I know you work hard." "It's my job, Julian. You do it better than anyone else," Julian said softly, turning his attention back to the starry sky. Elias left the cockpit feeling like he had just been electrocuted. His skin was burning where Julian had touched him. But the quiet romance of that moment was shattered 3 hours later. The storm system over the northern Pacific had escalated into a record-breaking blizzard. The weather radar on the flight deck suddenly lit up in angry reds and purples. The turbulence hit like a freight train. Elias was in the aisles when the plane dropped suddenly. He caught himself on a passenger seat just as Julian's voice came over the PA system, tight and authoritative. "Flight attendants, take your jump seats immediately." Elias hurried to the front, strapped himself into his harness, and watched as the cabin shook violently. The passengers were terrified. The overhead bins rattled loudly. The interphone chimed again. Elias snatched it up. "Elias, are you strapped in?" Julian's voice was tense. "Yes, Captain." "Are you hurt?" The specific concern in Julian's voice made Elias's breath catch. "No, I'm okay." "Good." Julian exhaled heavily. "Listen to me." The storm front shifted abruptly. "The entire Alaskan coast is being hammered by a massive whiteout blizzard. We can't climb over it, and fuel constraints mean we can't route around it back to the coast safely. We are diverting to an emergency secondary airport in northern Alaska. It's going to be a very rough landing. Keep the cabin calm." "Understood." "Elias?" Julian paused. "I've got you. Just hold on." Elias closed his eyes. "I trust you, Julian." The next 40 minutes were the most terrifying of Elias's life. The massive plane shook and groaned as it descended into the freezing, violent storm. Outside the windows, it was just a chaotic swirl of blinding white snow. But through it all, Julian flew the plane with absolute, terrifying precision. When the wheels finally slammed onto the icy, snow-covered runway, the reverse thrust roared, and the heavy aircraft slid, shuddered, and eventually came to a safe, complete stop on the tarmac. The cabin erupted into applause. But their problems were just beginning. The small, remote Alaskan airport was completely paralyzed. The blizzard was so severe that all terminal gates were frozen shut. Ground crews were operating on skeleton staff. It took 3 agonizing hours just to get the passengers off the plane via emergency-covered stairs and shuttled to the terminal, where they would be put up in local emergency shelters. But aviation regulations and the specific airline protocol required someone to stay with the aircraft. Because the plane couldn't be hooked up to external ground power in the severe storm, the auxiliary power unit, the APU, had to be kept running manually to prevent the airplane's internal water systems from freezing and causing millions of dollars in damage. Julian, as the captain, refused to leave his ship. He volunteered to stay on board overnight to monitor the flight deck systems until the storm broke the next morning. The rest of the crew was exhausted and practically begged to go to the terminal. But as they packed their bags, Elias stood in the galley, watching the freezing snow pound against the small window in the door. He made his decision. When the freezing, snow-covered ground agent came up the stairs to escort the crew away, Elias turned to the first officer. "Go. Get some rest. I'm staying." "Elias, are you crazy? It's going to be freezing in here. The APU can barely run the emergency heaters. Come to the terminal. Someone has to secure the galleys and ensure the cabin safety equipment doesn't freeze. As purser, I'm staying." The truth was, there was absolutely no way Elias was leaving Julian alone on a freezing, empty airplane in the middle of a blizzard. Once the door was sealed shut from the inside, a profound, eerie silence fell over the aircraft. Have you ever been inside a massive commercial airliner when it's completely empty? It's surreal. There were nearly 400 empty seats stretching back into the darkness. The only lights were the floor strip lights and the dim emergency panels overhead. The hum of the APU in the tail was a low, constant vibration, and outside, the wind howled like a wounded animal, shaking the metal frame of the plane. Elias shivered, zipping his uniform sweater up to his neck. It was already getting cold. He heard heavy footsteps coming down the aisle from the flight deck. Julian stepped into the first-class cabin. He had taken off his uniform jacket and his tie. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing strong, lightly scarred arms. He looked incredibly exhausted, running a hand through his usually perfect dark hair, making it messy. He stopped dead when he saw Elias standing in the galley. "Elias, what are you doing here?" The crew shuttle left. Julian's brow furrowed, a mix of confusion and something else, something softer, something like relief, flashing in his eyes. "I stayed," Elias said simply, stepping out into the dim aisle. "I couldn't let you freeze to death alone on a multi-million-dollar aircraft. Someone has to make sure you actually eat something." Julian stared at him. The space between them in the dark, empty first-class cabin felt impossibly small. The wind slammed against the fuselage, but inside, the air was entirely still. Julian took a slow step closer. "You shouldn't have done that. It's going to drop to near freezing in here tonight. The heaters can't keep up without the main engines." "I'm not leaving you, Julian." The words slipped out before Elias could stop them. They sounded too intimate, too devoted for a standard crew dynamic. Julian's breath hitched slightly. He looked down at Elias, his gaze dropping to Elias's lips for a fraction of a second before he caught himself and looked away, his jaw tightening. "Right. Well, since you're here, we should probably make camp in the first-class suites. The pods will retain some body heat. Grab all the blankets you can find from the overhead bins. Let's take a quick breather here. Just a small reminder, if you are completely captivated by this story and want more continuations, bonus scenes, early access, and uncensored 18+ BL content, you can support me on SpicyTimeBL on Patreon. The link is right there in the description and pinned comment. Your support keeps these emotional, slow-burn stories coming. Now, let's get back to the cold, empty plane. An hour later, the temperature in the cabin had dropped drastically. You could almost see their breath in the air. The vast darkness of the airplane was terrifying, but the first-class cabin felt like a small, private sanctuary. Elias had raided the storage closets. He brought an armful of the thick, plush luxury blankets and the large pillows reserved for first-class passengers. Julian had chosen 2 of the large suite pods right across the aisle from each other, but as Elias handed him a blanket, Julian noticed Elias visibly shivering. Julian frowned, a deep line appearing between his eyebrows. "You're freezing." "I'm okay," Elias lied through chattering teeth. He sat down in the plush seat, pulling a blanket around his shoulders. "I run cold." Julian stood in the aisle, looking down at him. The commanding, strict captain persona was completely gone. In the dim, bluish emergency light, he just looked like a man who was deeply concerned for someone he cared about. Without a word, Julian stepped into Elias's suite. The first-class pods were designed to be spacious for one person, but definitely not for 2 grown men. Julian didn't care. He sat down right next to Elias, the side of his heavy thigh pressing firmly against Elias's leg. Elias's eyes widened, his heart slamming against his ribs. "Julian? We need to conserve body heat, Elias. Don't argue with me. It's basic survival." Julian's voice was a low grumble, but he avoided eye contact as he took his own blanket and draped it completely over the both of them, effectively trapping them in a dark, incredibly warm cocoon. Elias couldn't breathe. Julian was so close. He could smell Julian's cologne, a mix of cedar, clean laundry, and the faint, ozone scent of the cockpit. He could feel the solid, radiating heat coming from Julian's large body. They sat in silence for a long time. The only sounds were the howling blizzard outside and the quiet, rhythmic sound of Julian's breathing. Slowly, the freezing cold began to fade, replaced by a different kind of heat. A burning, tense, romantic heat that made Elias's skin flush. "You did brilliantly today," Julian suddenly whispered into the darkness. His shoulder was pressed firmly against Elias's. "During the diversion, you kept the cabin perfectly silent. I could hear your voice over the interphone. You sounded so brave." Elias turned his head. Julian was looking right at him. They were mere inches apart. "I was terrified," Elias admitted, his voice trembling slightly. Not from the cold, but from the unbearable intimacy of Julian's gaze. "But I knew you were flying. I knew you wouldn't let anything happen to us." Julian's eyes darkened. He shifted slightly, turning his body more toward Elias inside the tight space of the pod. The heavy blankets rustled. "You have too much faith in me," Julian murmured. "People think I'm this machine, unfeeling, strictly by the book." "I don't think that," Elias whispered. No? Julian's voice was incredibly soft, incredibly vulnerable. What do you think of me, Elias? Elias swallowed hard. He looked down at where Julian's hand was resting on his knee under the blanket. Slowly, hesitantly, Elias moved his own hand and gently placed his fingers over Julian's knuckles. Julian didn't pull away. In fact, Julian slowly turned his hand over and intertwined his large, warm fingers perfectly with Elias's. I think, Elias breathed out, tracing his thumb over the back of Julian's hand, that you hide behind your uniform. I think you are the most deeply caring person I have ever met, and I think you look at me sometimes, when you think I'm not paying attention. Julian let out a shaky breath. He squeezed Elias's hand tightly. I look at you all the time, Elias. The confession hung in the cold air, heavy and intoxicating. Do you know how hard it is? Julian continued, his voice rough, thick with repressed emotion. Do you know how hard it is to sit in that cockpit, flying a plane for 14 hours, knowing you are just a few feet away on the other side of that door? I always look for your name on the roster, every month. When the schedules come out, I scan the crew list just hoping to see E. Thorne. Elias's breath caught in his throat. Tears pricked the corners of his eyes. You requested me for this flight? I've requested you for every flight for the last 6 months, Julian confessed, his voice breaking slightly. He reached up with his free hand, his fingers gently, reverently touching the side of Elias's face. His thumb brushed over Elias's cheekbone. But I'm the captain. I'm supposed to be responsible. I can't cross that line. If I made you uncomfortable, if I ruined your career... Julian, Elias interrupted softly. He leaned his face into Julian's warm palm, closing his eyes at the contact. I have been desperately in love with you for a year. I stayed on this freezing plane tonight because the thought of being away from you physically hurt. Julian's breath hitched violently. The silence that followed wasn't tense, it was explosive. The absolute relief, the raw longing that had been buried under years of professional courtesy and strict uniform codes finally broke. Julian moved. He leaned in closer, his tall, broad frame shielding Elias entirely from the cold cabin. He pressed his forehead against Elias's. Are you sure? Julian whispered, his lips brushing against Elias's jaw, sending fireworks of heat through Elias's entire body. Because once I cross this line with you, Elias, I am never going back. I won't be able to. Cross it, Elias begged softly. Please? Julian didn't hesitate anymore. He cupped the back of Elias's neck, his fingers tangling in his hair, and finally, desperately, brought their lips together. The kiss was like nothing Elias had ever experienced. It wasn't rushed, but it was incredibly intense, filled with months of silent longing, stolen glances in the crew room, and the adrenaline of surviving the storm. Julian kissed him, the way he did everything else, with total authority, passion, and devastating precision. Elias let out a soft sigh, melting completely into Julian's embrace. He wrapped his arms around Julian's neck, pulling the broad-shouldered pilot closer. Julian groaned softly, wrapping both arms around Elias's waist, pulling him practically onto his lap beneath the heavy blankets. The cold, empty airplane disappeared. The howling blizzard outside didn't matter. The only thing that existed was the heat of Julian's mouth, the tight, possessive grip of his hands, and the incredible realization that this man, this untouchable, commanding captain, belonged to him. When they finally broke apart to breathe, Julian rested his forehead against Elias's, both of them panting softly. Julian's eyes were completely dark, filled with an emotion so raw and beautiful it made Elias's heart ache. You are so beautiful, Julian whispered, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to Elias's forehead, then another to his temple, and finally one more gentle peck on his lips. I've wanted to do that since the first day you walked onto my aircraft. Then you waited entirely too long, Captain, Elias teased breathlessly, a brilliant smile breaking across his face. Julian chuckled, a deep, rich, wonderful sound that reverberated in his chest. He pulled the blanket tighter around them, pulling Elias's head down to rest securely on his chest, right over his beating heart. Go to sleep, Elias. I've got you. I'm not going anywhere. And for the rest of the night, as the storm raged fiercely over the Alaskan tarmac, they stayed wrapped in each other's arms in the dark, silent airplane. Elias listened to the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of the man he loved, feeling safer and warmer than he ever had in his entire life. Hours later, the deep blue of the night began to soften. The howling wind died down, replaced by a serene, heavy silence. Elias woke up to the feeling of Julian's fingers gently stroking his hair. The dim emergency lights had automatically shut off as the morning sun began to pierce through the small oval windows of the cabin, casting bright, golden rays across the empty first-class seats. Elias blinked sleepily, looking up. Julian was awake, watching him with an expression so incredibly soft and full of love that it took Elias's breath away all over again. Morning, Julian whispered, his voice raspy from sleep. Morning, Elias smiled, nuzzling closer into Julian's warm chest. Did the storm break? It did, Julian said softly. I just saw the airport snowplows clearing the tarmac. The ground crew will be here in about 20 minutes to hook up the external power. A sudden wave of sadness washed over Elias. The magic was ending. The isolated bubble they had lived in for the past 12 hours was about to burst, and they would have to go back to being Captain Vance and Purser Thorn. Julian seemed to sense his shift in mood. He gently lifted Elias's chin, forcing Elias to look him in the eyes. Hey, Julian said firmly, his gray eyes intense and unwavering. What did I tell you last night? Elias swallowed. That once you crossed the line, you weren't going back. Exactly. Julian smiled softly, leaning down to press a firm, sweet kiss to Elias's lips. When we walk off this plane, you are not just my flight attendant anymore. You are mine. We will figure out the airline rules. We will figure out the scheduling. I will bid for every single route you take. I don't care. I'm not hiding this, and I'm not losing you. Elias felt a tear slip down his cheek, but it was a tear of pure, overwhelming happiness. Okay, he whispered. Okay. They heard the heavy thud of the ground crew attaching the boarding stairs to the front left door. The radio in the flight deck crackled to life. Julian sighed, kissing Elias one last time before slowly, reluctantly untangling himself from the blankets. He stood up in the aisle, stretching his long, powerful body, before turning back to look at Elias. Fix your tie, Mr. Thorne, Julian teased gently, the professional captain persona slipping back into place, but this time, there was a playful, romantic twinkle in his eye. We have a plane to hand over. Elias laughed, sitting up and straightening his uniform. Yes, Captain. As they stood by the main door, waiting for the ground crew to open it from the outside, Julian reached out and secretly held Elias's hand, lacing their fingers together one last time in the quiet shadows of the galley. The heavy door clicked and swung open, letting in a blast of freezing, crisp Alaskan air and the blinding light of the morning sun bouncing off the pristine white snow. Julian let go of Elias's hand just in time, stepping forward to greet the ground manager with his usual authoritative nod. Morning, Captain, the manager called out, bundled in a massive parka. Hell of a night. You two survived the freeze? Julian turned his head slightly, locking eyes with Elias. A soft, secret smile graced the captain's lips. A smile meant only for Elias. We did just fine, Julian said smoothly, his deep voice carrying over the crisp winter air. In fact, it was the best night of my life. And that is where we will leave our captain and his beautiful flight attendant for tonight. I hope you felt the cold of that empty plane and the intense, slow-burn heat that finally kept them warm. Thank you so much for listening. If you want the continuation of these storytelling videos, bonus scenes, early access, and more uncensored 18+ BL content, I warmly invite you again to join my Patreon, SpicyTimeBL. The link is in the description and the pinned comment below. Your support is what allows me to keep sitting here telling you these romantic, dramatic stories. Until next time, stay safe, stay warm, and keep dreaming. Good night.